Hello, my name is David Malone, and I work at the United Nations University in Tokyo, where we're very fortunate to have with us today as a guest Graciana del Castillo of Columbia University in Japan for the first time. And by coincidence, happy coincidence for us, she just has a book out called Guilty Party, the International Community in Afghanistan. I actually read parts of it some months ago, but it's wonderful to see the book out. Graciana has a very rich background both in security and in thinking about and working on development. Her PhD is in fact in economics, and she brings together, which is unusual, both dimensions, so she's uniquely qualified to express herself on war economies, international efforts to help conflict-prone or conflict-ridden countries recover. And Afghanistan is a terrific contemporary example, first of all, because the security problems in Afghanistan have been very long-running. Secondly, because a great deal has been tried. Third, because a great deal of money has been spent on what has been tried. And so our chat today is going to focus in part on Afghanistan. But first, I want to back up a little bit and ask Graciana how she came to drift into this field of conflict from the field of economics she had started out in. So Graciana, how did you start?
Well, in fact, I did start at the UN. I had just finished my PhD in the late 80s, and I started working with the Director General first at the end of the 80s. And then when Boutros Ghali was elected president, he decided he didn't want a number two, which was the head of the Director General's office. And he took me to coordinate with the economic bodies of the UN from his office.
Yes.
And it was then the end of the Cold War, and that's when many countries started coming out of these Cold War related conflicts. And that's when I first started working on the economic reconstruction of El Salvador and Cambodia and later Guatemala, Angola, and things and countries
and
like
of
that.
course, while each country is different, each experiment in these countries is very interesting. And in El Salvador, I believe you conceived of and oversaw a program to, in effect, settle the people conducting the war, involving, in a way, the exchange of land for a commitment to peace. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I think that program that was very criticized by the World Bank and other organizations, it was criticized because it was not effective from an economic point of view. However, it led to a perfect ceasefire, and there was never any going back to war, despite all the problems that we had. And I think we learned a lot from that program. Unfortunately, the UN, which I think it's the perfect institution because of their impartiality to deal and to lead economic reconstruction in these countries, I think they don't have an institutional memory, and we have repeated many of the mistakes over and over just because we don't have, the UN doesn't have an institutional memory. So this is something to think about. In fact, I think Afghanistan, El Salvador is one of the countries most effective in terms of the reconstruction from the point of view of UN involvement.
Well, that program actually, in many ways, reminds me of something that was tried a couple of years later successfully in Mozambique by Aldo Aiello, which was to help the leader of the rebels who, in effect, wanted to settle, but whose lieutenants and others needed a reason to be able to settle, a livelihood to go back to. And so Aldo was able to mobilize resources to make it
he was
possible.
Brilliant. He was brilliant.
Absolutely.
The best special representative of the Secretary
Absolutely.
General.
But that also was very
to,
criticized because it was unusual.
But this is the lesson we learned. You see, we learned that development economists would tell you we have to treat everybody with the same need equally. However, at the UN, in the early 90s, we learned that you have disarmed groups, that you have to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate productively somehow, or through the new police or armed forces, but you have to reintegrate them so that they can have a stake in the peace process. Otherwise, they're going to go to war, back to war. And we haven't learned that in the case of Afghanistan, for instance. We tried the demobilization and the disarmament, but there was no permanent reintegration. And then those demobilized, they went back to arms.
Now your book is, I was rereading a bit of it earlier today, and I recall that you're fairly critical of international efforts to, in effect, support the economy of Afghanistan. And I wanted to ask you about that. What do you think the international community did wrong, and what should it have done, in your view?
In my view, well, first of all, I think the security and the economics go, there is a reverse causality. You cannot have security if you have 80% of the population without a livelihood. And this is what we neglected. We as the international community neglected in Afghanistan. 80% of the population lives from the rural sector. And we went through, we tried high productivity programs. We tried commercial agriculture, for instance. For that, we needed to build the infrastructure. In the meantime, the country went back to war.
Yes, and what, though, do you think a sensible approach would have been in Afghanistan?
Well, two things I think we fail very much. First of all, we know that when the countries come out of war, the economics of war, the underground economy, we have to, as we move forward, we have to eliminate that and create a legal economy. And we didn't do that. We allowed the drug sector. Remember that the Taliban had imposed a ban on poppy production. And so the production was very low in 2001. From 2002, when we went in, we should have created livelihood possibilities, even if it were at subsistence level for the large majority of farmers. Otherwise, they would go back to poppy production, which is what. To give you an idea, during the Taliban period, on average, because it fluctuates year to year, on average, 2,600 tons were produced a year. Since 2002, production has averaged 5,200, exactly twice as much.
Yes.
Why? Because we didn't create, we went with this dogmatism. We want to create a perfect democracy with a perfect market economy. And this was not possible. It was unrealistic in a country like Afghanistan. But Afghanistan, when I was there the first time in '78, just before the communist coup, Afghanistan had food security. It was a beautiful country in peace with food security, and you could see the fantastic fruits and crops and everything else. So why didn't we go back to basics and try to create livelihoods for? I remember that during the Soviets, the whole countryside was mined. So we had to do the basic things so that people could go back to the crops and to the production that they had before the war.
I remember, exactly, you laid some emphasis in the book on the fact that by leapfrogging to the idea of commercial agriculture, large scale, requiring infrastructure, which there was no time to build, the planners had neglected basic agriculture, sort of subsistence agriculture.
Exactly.
And so, in effect, you have a rather grim outlook for Afghanistan as the international community withdraws. You think the economy will, in fact, in part, implode.
Well, you see, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I mean, we don't even know what will happen in terms of the troops that are remaining, in terms of the new government and so forth. So I want to be positive, and I think there are ways in which Afghanistan can go to the basics. The interesting thing for me is that we have spent so much in the security of the country, in creating the security forces, that it's not sustainable. So we have created, and especially through US aid, we have created an institution that they won't be able to sustain for years to come. And I don't think that the levels of aid that they will need going forward are feasible. So something has to give in. And I think there will have to be more negotiations with the Taliban. And they will have to reduce the security forces because they won't be able to finance them fiscally. So you have to have some kind of reconciliation with armed groups so that the security cost decreases. And once you do that, then I think there are ways in which the country can start making up for the deficiencies in the past. It's interesting that the government itself, every document, they talk about the need for pro-poor growth and for agricultural production. You know, it's a country that it's importing. Imports are about 30 percentage points of GDP larger than exports, you know?
Hard to sustain.
We economists think that a 3% deficit is a problem. They have a deficit which is over 30%. So you understand that this is not sustainable. And I think, you know, we can't change Afghanistan by changes at the margin. I think we have to rethink the whole strategy. You know, we have been doing things in a very fragmented way. We built a bridge here, we build a road somewhere else, a school here. You know, the indicators are really terrible for the money that has spent. You know, since 2009, the international community has financed something like 90% of GDP in aid. For the whole period, since 2002, Afghanistan received at least 75% of GDP in aid.
Yes, absolutely. And most countries that receive very high proportions of aid, interestingly, fail to develop strong local economies.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the three countries I've been working on most recently, Liberia, Afghanistan, and even Mozambique, are examples of that. I mean, Mozambique is a country that after 20 years of war, and this is why the contrast with El Salvador is so interesting, because El Salvador is a country that did not receive much aid, very little aid, something like 8% of GDP, because they had a per capita income above $1,000, so they weren't able to get concessional loans. And they didn't go back to war, and they didn't become aid dependent, and that's unique. Mozambique, they signed the peace agreement the same year, and you know, after 2 decades of very large aid as percentage of their GDP, they are at the bottom of the Human Development Index.
Absolutely.
So something is wrong.
Indeed. Now, for our viewers online, you're unfortunate in the sense that you won't be with us this evening in Tokyo for a public event that Graciana is doing, talking more about her book with an audience here in the city. But we did want to bring you these few minutes so you'd get a sense of what she's been writing about, what she's been thinking about, and you may want to take an interest in what she's been writing. Some of it will be quite controversial. It's very thought-provoking. And for those who study war economies and the economy of bringing peace to countries, this is very important work. Thank you very much for joining us, Graciana. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me.